We are parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello, this is Marlon Detweiler with Veritas Press. Today, our guest on Veritas Vox is Mary Kay Andreades. You'll learn that Mary Kay teaches for our online school, Veritas Scholars Academy, and that will come out through the interview. Mary has proposed a topic which we have accepted. What has Veritas to do with Lux and Veritas? I'm not going to ask you to answer that question yet. I'd like to have you give a little background. First of all, in teaching for Veritas, you've been around how many years?
Too many, yes.
Mary Kay was very early on. At this moment, we are in our 16th year, and I believe that she has been teaching more than a dozen of those, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
How did you get connected with Veritas in the first place?
Well, my background was I went to an elite all-girls public school in the Washington, D.C. area, and I had a wonderful classical-ish education of small classes, close reading of classic texts, writing essays, and then I went on to Yale, and there I saw what I loved about Yale was very intellectually on students, very the kind of people when the teacher asks a question, 70% of the hands go up, right? People that want to know, and that was thrilling. Then later I became a Christian, and I wound up with more education than money, but I had seen something of what a good education was. And so when I was attracted to the Veritas curriculum early on. So in the 90s, I was attracted to the Phonics Museum. I used that to teach my children to read. And when I saw the online classes and the whole program of the classical education, I said, this is it. I've seen this. This is it. It's even better because I'm not only able to ask big questions about humanity, I'm able to ask the big theological questions. It's like my classical-ish education, only better. So I was an early adopter. And I used some of the very first online classes. My sons took them. One of them is now graduating from law school after learning to argue in the very first Omnibus logic classes. He's graduating this spring.
Wow, that's great. You suggested a title that I think needs some explanation.
Yeah.
This is what it is. I mentioned it earlier. What has Veritas to do with Lux and Veritas? What do you mean by that? Why are you wanting to pursue this thinking?
Well, Lux and Veritas is the motto of Yale, right? And originally, of course, Yale was.
You say that like I should know that. I didn't know that.
I'm sorry.
And of course, Lux is Latin for light, and Veritas.
Right. So I thought, well, that sounds a lot like my school name, right? Yeah. Veritas. And so that was originally, of course, started out of, it was originally a school for training ministers, and they've fallen from their original goal. I feel like we're doing the real thing at Veritas, what they tried to do at Yale and have kind of fallen away from it. So we really do care about, Veritas means truth. We really actually do care about light and truth. I would say Yale less so cares about that. They don't care about it as much as they used to.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned that you came to Christ through the process of your education, but I know a little bit about that, and I think the people listening would really love to hear a brief summary of how you came to Christ and just how the Holy Spirit moved in your life to bring about you becoming a Christian.
Okay, well, Marlon, I grew up in a cult. I was a Christian Scientist, And although Christian Scientists do read we did at that time read the King James Bible. So I was kind of a lonely, bookish child. I read my King James Bible, my special Christian Science book, also C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and fairy tales. So I had these beautiful stories in my head in the mix. Then I went to this prep school. It happened to be President Ford's daughter was there. There were Jordanian princesses and senators' daughters there. So it was a good education. And I continued to read these great books. And I also, took in a lot of pride, when the Greek mythology, which was another thing I loved to read, there is this memory in Greek mythology that there's been a rebellion against the creators, and the Greek gods, they're the promoters of excellence and pride, and that's all very appealing to us. So through my high school career, I had the feeling that I could go in the direction of excellence and prestige and also read these great stories. So I took Latin there, which I love about Veritas, that we study Latin. I think that was actually the key to my higher SAT scores back in the day. I love
say that to people. It's interesting that you can say it firsthand.
This is why, yeah. And you can kind of taste the words down to their roots. And I still love that to this day. So I do recommend Latin for that. So I did learn that there. And then, I felt like I was on this conveyor belt of excellence and, Athena and everything. And I ended up at Yale. Also, I learned to paint, which was interesting. At my school, we had the arts. So I'm interested in how to combine classical education with the arts. I think there's a smart way to do that at Veritas. So that's how I ended up at Yale, and I'm being an artist. It's all working out. And I decide, fatefully, not to become a lawyer, which would have been the smart thing to do with that education. I try to do something really hard. I think, well, I'll become a culture maker and I'll follow this path. So I went to New York to be an artist, and all of a sudden nobody cared that I was this nice girl from this elite school. Nobody cared, and it was very hard. And I'm so grateful that I had that experience of failure, Yale, to trying to make it in the art world. And then that God used that to show me that thing I'd been reading all along, the Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. I had no idea C.S. Lewis was a Christian book when I read it as a child. That thing, it kind of led me, like there's something underlying this. There's some kind of path here. And I ended up becoming a Christian. I really thought about C.S. Lewis. I thought about that feeling that I had when I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's something there. I have to follow that. So it was the classic books that led me really to the Lord. And I ended up becoming a Christian in New York City. And so fast forward that, a couple years later, I'm married to a pastor raising 4 children in New York City. And I kind of drop out of the counterculture to do that. And so now I'm thinking, I don't have the finances to do that prep school education. How do I do this? And when I saw the Veritas catalog, I was electrified. Huh. And I thought, well, this is it. This is it. This is the great books. This is the great story, and this is how I want to raise my children. I also, at the same time there in Brooklyn, we were a little ahead of the time. My Yale cohort went off to kind of change our views on gender and all these different things. They're out there kind of ruining the culture today. And so there I was in Brooklyn with these children, and along comes the rainbow curriculum. I got a hold of the curriculum that was proposed for my kindergartners, and it was a full math and English curriculum, K through 6. And as an integral part of that curriculum in the early 90s, they were going to bring in community experts to teach our children about alternative families, right?
So this is the 90s.
This is the 90s.
Most of us have, in the last few years, been seeing this ostensibly for the first time, when it really has been infiltrated into the curriculum. And you're seeing this 30 years ago.
Yeah, I got a copy of that, and I thought this is not what I want for my kindergartner. And also at the same time, I got a hold of For the Children's Sake by Susan Schaefer Macaulay, and that was the gateway into homeschooling for me. And so then when Veritas came along, and then the live classes were added, I just saw how valuable this was. And so I advocate parents actually kind of hacking this elite education. I feel like we are offering all kinds of students what used to be the goods of the old-fashioned classical education. It's no longer there at Yale. It's no longer there in my elite prep school, but we are like the caretakers of this story. And we are bringing this, I get very excited about bringing this to all kinds of students who don't come from, don't grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth. So I'm excited about doing that. I've done that with my 4 children, and now I'm excited about doing that with other people's children.
What, obviously you mentioned Yale's roots were training pastors. That was true at Harvard. We're talking about hundreds of years ago.
Yes.
The education is very different today. What do you see in a classical Christian education that distinguishes it not just from a secular classical education, but also from a traditional Christian education? What is it about classical Christian education that has really caused you to say, as you said earlier, this is it, and has caused you to call it a hacking, so to speak, of what those very well-established institutions have purported and been over the years?
Good question. Well, I remember thinking at certain points of my education, I'm not allowed to ask the real questions. I remember thinking that I had to hide my religious background, even in prep school. Like, they won't understand. What I'm really wondering is these big questions about God. So I could ask questions at my wonderful English class. We could talk about the Greek idea of fate and what that meant. And those were interesting big questions. But I couldn't say, is God real? Did he make the world? I couldn't ask those even bigger questions. It was so refreshing to be able to ask the truly big questions at Veritas. I had this feeling of just the world of education getting bigger and including more. Mm-hmm. I think so. For instance, some of my well-loved books. I wish every Christian could read Eusebius. It's the first book. It's the first church history after the end of the Bible. Like, what happened after the Bible? It's so wonderful. I wish all the parents could read this I advise them to. So getting parts of this history, the religious parts of the history, which are left out because, so for instance, another example of leaving the important parts out, in our public school, students get a kind of a sequence through history. So American history, they learn about the Puritans without learning about the Reformation. So the Puritans are kind of reduced to the Salem witch trials and reading the sinners in the hands of an angry God without understanding the gospel. So you come to sinners, and that's your only text for understanding the Puritans. You think, wow, Jonathan Edwards sounds angry, and you have no idea that he's talking about, being saved from that. You have no idea. So leave it there. So the secular education leaves these big holes in people's understanding. And I remember feeling like these things are being restored as I was homeschooling with my children, these parts, these really important parts of the story.
I have recently been, we've been addressing for years people who have not valued a Christian education, let alone a classical Christian education. And recently, just as an exercise, and I wasn't surprised, but it was still a stark reminder. I Googled 10 most important events in history. And I never found a list that included the incarnation or God becoming man. Now, some might say, well, what's really important is the resurrection. I'm kind of grouping all of those things, the presence of Christ, his work, his miracles, his death, his resurrection, all as one. And even with that understanding, not a single list included that when looking at the 10 most important events in history, according to the lists that had been posted. And that's really telling, because even the most agnostic or even atheistic historian would naturally recognize that when Christ appeared, things changed, and the way people were dealt with, the creation of hospitals and universities and war, and the way wars were fought, what wars were fought about, all of those things were dramatically impacted by that singular event. And yet they refuse, or haven't to this point, put the incarnation on the list.
Right.
To me, that is one of the most dishonest things imaginable. Yeah. Even coming at it from a secular vantage point. Any thoughts on that?
Right, absolutely. One of the books that we teach is on the incarnation, the granddaddy of all books about the incarnation. And I love that I get to do that with 8th graders. It is the pivotal thing in our history. And it's this giant hole that's left. You will not understand your world if you don't understand the incarnation, right?
Yeah, it's really astounding how secular our culture has become. One of the things you mentioned as we talked about this prior to the interview was the idea of fairy tales and mythology and those stories and how they shaped your childhood and how they now impact you today. Tell us about that.
Yes, I think growing up, I believe in children growing up with these good stories. Fairy tales, myths, they have truths in them. And I still draw on these today. I want children to have that, even if they, maybe have a learning disability. The great stories are very instructive. I have now, the learning about Greek mythology, learning about, I many times return to fairy tales. I think I've become that wizened old woman in the forest that you come by when you're on your quest, and you better listen to her because she has she knows the way up the mountain. She knows how to get around the obstacles. I've become that person, right?
That's great. What a great analogy. There's something else that you wrote that I have read recently that really needs some unpacking. Art is long, but people are eternal. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so, I wanted to become an artist, and I still do art. I still do that. And there used to be a saying, life is short, art is long, right? And that's true. Yes, Beowulf, that book is lasted a long time, but there's something that lasts longer than art. There's something that lasts longer than great books, and that's people. People are actually eternal. So I like to say life is short, art is long, but people are eternal. Yeah. So the way we interact with these young people, that has an impact for eternity, right?
It really putting that in perspective, the idea of shaping a child for all of eternity is a very, very sobering consideration as we think about being parents. How would you say they're addressing people that might say, what does, make sure I get this right, Rome have to do with Jerusalem? Is that right?
Yeah, I guess that was what I was thinking of. What does Rome have to do with Jerusalem?
And the idea of how do classical books that we read in the omnibus that are not of Christian content, how do they fit together with the gospel? Why are they important?
That's really good. That's really a good question. So I love that so for instance, I love teaching Beowulf. Beowulf shows kind of a pagan mindset, this pagan warrior mindset. In my with the older students, I teach the saga of the Volsungs, and it's a very dark, claustrophobic worldview. Beowulf is a little different because it's written by a Christian looking back, so there's a little bit of foreshadowing, but you can learn a lot by looking at the pagan. The pagan worldview, the Sigurd character, the Beowulf. Do we really want to go back to that in a world where there's no gospel? So reading those and contrasting them, interacting with them together is fantastic. Right now, in my other, on the other extreme, we're reading Molière. Molière was kind of a free thinker. He was not espousing a Christian worldview, and we're reading Tartuffe, which in my experience is usually read to make fun of Christians. It seems like everybody gets this idea. Tartuffe is about a hypocrite in French Enlightenment France. And I've seen this played on stage, and usually people say, I have a great idea. Let's make Tartuffe a modern evangelical and make fun of them. Ha, 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 ha. That's usually what people do. But actually, it's kind of fun to read this, in-house, right? Because we do encounter hypocrisy and talk about it and engage. And, Mr. Molière is really, he has his own axe to grind. So analyzing the non-Christian, not being afraid of the non-Christian books and analyzing them is very fruitful, right?
Yeah,
culture before Christ and post-Christ culture. Yeah.
Yeah, we've grown up with some significant element of influence that says, don't touch secular things.
Yeah.
Stay within the Christian community entirely. And our Great Books curriculum, the Omnibus, has said no to that way of looking at things in an effort to prepare students for anything that they encounter in life.
Absolutely.
You've seen that both as a teacher and a parent. Talk to me about the value and, if you believe so, the wisdom of doing that.
Yeah. Amen. I love that. I love that about Veritas. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid about reading other cultures. Actually, one of the things I love is that right now, this semester I taught the story of Marco Polo, and our curriculum is specifically Western civilization, which I think that's all we have time to do this pass through history. But we touch on Buddhism, we touch on Chinese religion, and we shouldn't be afraid of these things. We have these wonderful resources, and we have these classes where we can kind of deeply engage. And I love that. Another book I read, The Distant Mirror, we read parts of this. I call this the Middle Ages, the bad parts. Okay, right? Because let's face up to the bad behavior of the adults here, right? And analyze why it happened, right? It was terrible. I don't think we need to be afraid of that. I think the gospel and Christian teaching is realistic about humans and what they're like. So engaging with the bad parts of history is really important in preparing our students.
Yeah, the gospel is so overwhelmingly true and powerful that we need not fear those things that have attempted to dismantle it. But we have to think through them carefully and thoroughly so that they are really understood for what they are and what they aren't. That is, alternative and wrong-headed worldview thinking and beliefs. And
Yes.
how has that impacted your kids?
I think they really appreciate the feeling that I think they appreciate that I was not intellectually protective,
Yeah.
right? Like, bring me the competitors. Let's talk about it together. Let's engage with them. And I like going to the original sources. Okay, let's not read Siddhartha by, some Western guy. Let's read the stories about the Buddha. Let's read the stories. Let's read the original sources. Do we, or do we really want that, right? I think that we need to engage with the original sources, and that's helpful to them. They got the feeling that they could ask any question, right?
That's wonderful. What a great testimony to parenting that you have that kind of channel with your children, and I commend you for that. That is really, really good. Your teaching with Veritas has been very well received by the students, by the administration, and by us. It's been a wonderful thing. We're so thankful to have you, and the perspective that you bring to it, along with your credentials, really does validate what we're trying to accomplish. And it's so good to see it in your students and in your family. What did I not ask you about that you might want to say before we close? I didn't mean to stump you, so I'll fill in the silence a little bit. And if there isn't anything, that's certainly okay too. It has been, I think what you have said will really be impactful for those that are listening.
Here's something, one of the people that we study when we read Dante's Inferno with eighth graders, it's so amazing to get to do that. Students, middle schoolers really are, I love immersing them in the great literature. And maybe they don't pick up everything, but they pick up quite a bit, right? Middle schoolers really identify with Augustine's conversion, right? This idea that, he ate the pears just for the wickedness of it, not because he even wanted the pears, he threw them to the pigs. So I love engaging. Another interesting one that's become a big issue, when we read the Inferno, we read about Brunetto Latini, and there he is, he's in hell, and he's a homosexual. And so that's a big issue. And I love that we get to talk about, we don't shy away from the big issues with the kids. Yeah. And what's interesting is that this man is in the Inferno, not because he had same-sex attraction, but because he became an atheist in response to his difficulty. There are repentant sinners of all kinds higher up in purgatory and in heaven. People in the Inferno didn't have a response to their difficulties. So I like to teach this issue. I like to think about how, Dante is actually upset. This is a person who helped him. Like, I am sad that you're here in Inferno, Brunetto. And so I think it's wonderful to teach that. It's not that we don't have the same difficulties other people do. It's that we have somewhere to turn with them. Yeah. So I like using these classic, I like using that issue to say to students, you may have difficulties, you may have temptations, but there are resources for you in Christianity. And so I can talk about that in a way that doesn't single anybody out and kind of prepare them ahead of time to face this issue. So that's something I love about that our curriculum allows me to do.
Yeah. Well, that's become more important in the last few years too, to be able to address all kinds of unbiblical behavior and thinking. Thank you so much. Well,
Right.
today we've
Sure.
had Mary Kay Andreades. Thank you so much. You and your husband, Sam, have been a wonderful blessing to Veritas, and I appreciate being able to have this time with you. Keep up the great work. Thanks.
Thanks so much.